for thine own sake, whose joy thou thyself art. And this is the happy life, to rejoice to thee, of thee, for thee. This is it, and there is no other. For they who think there is another pursue some other, and not the true joy. We're in the middle of a series entitled Joy, and it is, on some levels, a perplexing study in the book of Philippians. The reason I say it is a perplexing study is because a central theme of the book is regular confessions of joy from the Apostle Paul as he writes to his dear friends at the church he planted in the city of Philippi. And if you were here last week, you would understand why I say that this study is sort of perplexing. Because Paul is writing this letter from prison. He's writing this letter in a prison cell that is buried under the ground, essentially. And he's writing and he's saying over and over and over again the joy he has. He's imprisoned in chains, and his opening statement to the church is this: I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all, making my prayer with joy. As we discovered last week, his joy was because of the gospel relationship he had with the people. That as he sat there in prison, he's able to say, I'm always in joy. I'm always praying this with joy. It was rooted in the gospel relationship he had with the people he was writing to. It was really rooted in a pastoral relationship anchored by the gospel. He had joy in prison because he had partnered with these people for the gospel work. He said in there, listen, I'm praying in joy because you've partnered with me from the very beginning in the gospel work, and you're partnering with me even now in the gospel work. And then he said, and because I know that the gospel work that God has started in you, God will finish it. So as we talked last week, the root of his joy was coming from this relationship he had with these people, knowing that the gospel was working in them, and the gospel was working through them, and the gospel was a part of their lives. As he was in prison, his joy was in the gospel being alive. His joy in the midst of assured misery was rooted in the work of the gospel. Now I understand, and what I want you guys to understand what I mean by the work of the gospel. For a lot of people, we talk about the gospel and it's become something that is just this simple idea that we're saved. I know for me, even growing up in the church and me even growing up in ministry, so often what we did is we created this idea that the gospel is simply Jesus Christ came and died for our sins, and if we receive him, we'll get saved. And that was the totality of what the gospel is. And although this is an essential part of the message of the gospel is all that was revealed through Jesus Christ. We got to remember that as we talk about this conversation, as we're having this conversation, we're going to see that over time and time again throughout Philippians, the joy that Paul is talking about is rooted in the gospel. And for you to understand what Paul's talking about, you got to understand the heart of the gospel. The gospel is all that was revealed through the life and the work and the teaching of Jesus Christ. The gospel is his life, it's his teaching, it's his work, it's his sacrifice in death, it's his victory in resurrection. The gospel is all that God revealed to us for our salvation and for our life through Jesus Christ. As we sit and we reflect on everything that Jesus said and everything that Jesus did, it's meant to be imprinted upon the hearts and the lives of believers. That's the gospel. When Paul sits down and he reflects, he says, listen, I'm sitting in this prison and I have joy in my prayer because I know that who Jesus Christ is having an impact in your life and the lives of others because of your work. He's saying, listen, I see people learning that they can love the Father and obey the Father. I know that people are living out forgiveness and living out sacrifice and living out love the way Jesus Christ did because the gospel has taken root. This is the joy that Paul has in this. The gospel that truly works in us. This gospel idea is what animated Paul in this. The gospel did a work in him, and that's why he could take joy in seeing the gospel do work in others, because it was paramount. J.D. Greear describes this gospel perspective, I think, in a way that we should all embrace. He says, the gospel has done its work in us when we crave God more than we crave anything else in life. And when we see his kingdom advance in the lives of others, gives us more joy than anything we could have on our own. When we see Jesus as greater than anything the world can offer, we'll gladly let everything else go to possess him. This explains Paul's writing with joy in his circumstances. And you have to understand that perspective if you're going to understand this book. You have to understand that that's what Paul was talking about. Every time he'd come to the question of the gospel work in the lives of them, every time he came to this conversation about them partnering with him in the gospel, that's the gospel he's talking about. He's looking at it and he's saying, I care more about this than anything else. You have to understand that. You have to understand that perspective if you're going to understand anything in the book of Philippians, including what we're going to look at today starting in chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Now, I want you to stop there. I want you to see what Paul is focused in on here, and I want you to see the enthusiasm with which he's focused. He's in prison, right? We've got that part so far, right? He's in prison. And part of the problem is, I think, when I talk about this, we might have a too sanitized view of the prison he was sitting in. I want to read to you a description of the prison from a historian as it related to the Roman Empire. He writes and he says this, often prisons of this kind were dug out of solid rock and were underground. Prisoners, their guards, and their provisions were lowered through an opening the size of a manhole. This manhole was the only means of entrance and exit. In the Roman Empire, these prisons could be under the marketplace. Rain and debris from the market and from animals easily dropped into this house of darkness. Neither animal waste nor that of the prisoners found its way out easily. The Mamertine prison in Rome, which was traditionally believed to be where Paul was held, was essentially two large rooms on different levels with iron shackles fixed to the walls. The Roman historian Sallust said of this dungeon, it is sunk about 12 feet underground. Walls secure it on every side, and over it is a vaulted roof connected with stone arches. But its appearance is disgusting and horrible by reason of the filth, darkness, and stench. This is Paul's existence as he writes this letter. This is where Paul is. This is what Paul is sitting in. This is what Paul is seeing. This is what Paul is smelling as he writes these words. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. That's crazy, isn't it? I mean, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As he's writing here, he sounds almost giddy about this, doesn't he? He's writing this and he's saying, guys, all of this stuff taking place, I want you to know, it's really moved the gospel forward. Like everybody knows about it. The entire Imperial Guard understand, I'm here for Christ. I'm here stuck in this hole. Stuck in this hole in the darkness and in the filth and in the smell. But you know what? A bunch of people know the gospel. This is the heart he has. He has an understanding that his life is not about his comfort, not about his wealth, not about his well-being, but it's about the gospel advancing into the world. Think about it. How's your life? Is your life hard? Do you face tough times? Can you relate in any way to what Paul's circumstances are? Do you see the hard times as a way to advance the gospel? And if it was advancing the gospel, would you even see that as a comfort in your heart and in your life? Would you say, listen, man, what I'm going through is really advancing the gospel. What I'm going through is really moving the gospel forward because everybody in the hospital ward knows that I'm here for the sake of the gospel. Everybody who's seen me lose my job knows that I'm here for the sake of advancing the gospel. And even in my darkness, even in my struggle, even my hard times, I rejoice because Jesus is faithful. Paul did not wallow in the darkness. Paul did not wallow in the prison. Paul did not wallow in the filth. But he seized the opportunity to express the gospel, and because of that, he rejoiced. You see, can you, when you're being treated unfairly, can you still be gracious so that the gospel is seen in you? Can you, when you're being dismissed, can you still be a servant so that the gospel is seen in you? If suffering, can you rejoice and still share Jesus Christ so that the gospel moves forward? The very first lesson from this passage is I exist for the gospel. I exist that the gospel will go forward. Your ability to find joy in the hard times will be in direct proportion to your ability to see your purpose as a gospel purpose. If your purpose is your comfort or prosperity, hard times will not be good. But if your purpose is God's glory all the time, having the gospel be brought forth in all the circumstances of your life, you will be able to find joy because you care about that more than anything else. I want the gospel. I want the gospel advanced. I want my life to represent the gospel. I want others to know the gospel. I want lives to be changed by the gospel. And whatever circumstance I find myself in, I want to see it as the opportunity for the gospel to advance. Continuing on, he said, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. This is crazy because as I've read through this, the two opening passages that we just read hold, in my mind, really shocking declarations. If you were ever to view this through natural eyes, if you were ever to view this through a natural understanding, it makes almost no sense whatsoever. It's the two things that Paul has written here so far, right? So he goes in, he says, listen, I'm in prison. My imprisonment has really helped to move the gospel forward. And he's excited about this, and he's enthusiastic about this. Man, I'm in this hole, I'm in this prison. Woo, this is great. Gospel's moving forward. That's pretty shocking. But then he goes in and he says, I want you to understand, brothers are now more confident to preach the gospel because of my imprisonment. Do you see how that doesn't seem to make sense? You're looking at Paul. Paul has been preaching the gospel. Because Paul's preaching the gospel, they put him in this hole, in the darkness, in his own feces. And all of a sudden, people are looking at it going, I'm going to start preaching the gospel too. All that bad stuff that happened to Paul, that's inspiring me to preach the gospel. It doesn't make sense, does it? When we think about that, Paul is in prison, in a hole, chained up because he was preaching the gospel, and this inspires people to preach the gospel. How does that work? Why does that become a thing? Why does that become a reality within the context of our understanding of what it means to be a Christian? And I'll tell you why it's a thing. This time of commitment, this ability to structure your life in a way that reveals your commitment to the gospel above everything else, will encourage others to do the same. When other people can look at you and they can see in you a joy and a peace and a happiness and a love and a servanthood that takes place in the midst of hard times, people look at that and say, there's something there. There's something beautiful there. There's something special there. There's something different there. See, when we can find peace and joy, when we can find a ability to preach the gospel confidently, when everything's good, when everything's fine, when we're wealthy and we're secure and safe, it doesn't testify too much, does it? It doesn't say much. It doesn't say much about the value of the gospel. It doesn't say much about the value of who Jesus Christ is. But when we can be rooted, when we can stay in the gospel, we can stay faithful to the gospel, we can stay committed to the gospel, even when we're going through hard times, even when we're going through difficult times, people look at that and say, there's power in the gospel. There's power in Jesus. There's power in that faithfulness. How many of you have ever seen this bore out in your life? Have you ever been around that Christian who in the midst of struggle, in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the hard times, still stands and says, Jesus Christ is my hope. Jesus Christ is my life. Jesus Christ is my everything. I rejoice in my circumstances. I find joy in my situation because my joy is not in this thing. My joy is in Jesus. You ever met that person? That is a life-changing person, isn't it? That is a life-impacting person. That is a person that inspires you to find Jesus in it all. And then to turn to others and say, man, the gospel is powerful. The gospel has meaning. This is something that I saw so clearly, and that many of you guys saw so clearly in the final stages of my mom's life. As she struggled through 4-stage cancer, those of you who knew her, those of you when she was a part of our congregation before she died, she always had joy in Jesus. She always had an expression that God was her everything. We've shown the video here where she sat and she says, I thank God for my cancer because it taught me more about Jesus and I value Jesus more than my life. See, it inspires us in those moments to go, Jesus is everything. How can I not preach Jesus? How can I not share Jesus? How can I not stand and say he means everything? Because Paul modeled for these believers the depth and the beauty of Jesus Christ alive. What could we do? What could we do if we were a church that says, all I have, all I am, is for the glory of the gospel? What can a gathered group of believers be? What can a gathered group of believers inspire? What can a gathered group of believers do in the name of Jesus Christ if every one of us said, everything I am, everything that I have, everything that is taking place in my life is for the glory of the gospel, period. It's not for my name. It's not for my sake. It's not for my comfort, but it's so that Jesus Christ may be seen in me. What can we do? Some indeed preach Christ, he says, from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Now this passage, this portion of this morning's text, holds, I think, a good deal of teaching that we don't see right off as you read these words. And I think it is so beneficial if we grasp what Paul is trying to say to us today. I want you to see the posture that Paul takes in this passage, because it shows us so much about how we must stand before the gospel and stand among the church. It tells us so much about how we are standing before the gospel as we look at the gospel as it affects our lives, and it teaches us how we should interact in the midst of the faith community, in the midst of other believers. Paul here is eminently humble in this exchange. Paul here is eminently humble in this exchange. He is standing before the gospel humbly, and he's standing before his brothers and sisters in humility. Paul is showing in his declaration how unimportant he is in light of the importance of the gospel. To really understand this passage, you have to see that it is a commentary on him and his interaction with other ministers of the day. You have to understand what he's talking about here is the relationship that he has, his personal relationship with other ministers who are out there preaching the gospel. Now keep that in mind as we look at this again, that this is a view of him. This is him talking about him and his situation. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of a selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Do you see how the emphasis here is? He's filtering what they're doing in relationship to his circumstances, his situation in prison. It's really about him. It's really about his interaction with them. You have to understand, he's not discussing a doctrinal issue here. He's not discussing even an integrity issue here. What he's discussing is a personal ministry rivalry, a difference of opinion that appears to revolve around his imprisonment. He's saying there's a bunch of people out there who don't like that I'm in prison. They think that there's something wrong with me having done this and been in this place. We tend to view the first century church as being monolithic. We tend to view this as though everybody kind of agreed. That Paul was like the universal spokes guy, and whatever he thought went. Or that there was this complete unity, that there were no real differences between the guys who were leading the church. And that's not accurate at all. In fact, you can go through and there's historians that will talk about the different conflicts that were taking place and different arguments that were being had. But in this particular case, what you have is you have these people looking at Paul and saying, what Paul's doing is not right. Paul is saying, I know people are critical of me. There are people who are saying my imprisonment is not beneficial, that it's not right, that maybe I'm grandstanding. See, what they were understanding is Paul's in Rome, Paul's in prison because he's pushing the issue. Paul didn't have to do this. Paul had outs along the way. He had the ability to step back. They were like, listen, you don't have to appeal to Rome. And he says, I'm going to appeal to Rome. And the reason he's appealing to Rome is because he sees it as an opportunity to have a chance to step in front of the emperor, to step in front of all of Rome and declare Jesus. And so there's all these Christians out there who are kind of saying, Paul, you're doing this to grandstand. You're doing this so that people will see you. And so they've been going around talking about Paul and saying what Paul's doing is not right. But Paul, in this declaration, doesn't get defensive because he understood the whole thing isn't about him. Paul was always very aware that he wasn't making a name for himself, so he didn't need to defend himself, but to make himself nothing compared to the gospel going forward. This is an example that he laid out all the time. As he was interacting with people, he was constantly wanting to say, listen, it's not about me. It's not about what I've said. It's not about what I've done. It's not about whether you follow me. Remember when there was that rivalry taking place in Corinth? And how there were a bunch of people, and they were saying, well, I follow Paul, and I follow Apollos, and I follow Peter. And Paul writes back to him, and he's like, listen, why is there this rivalry? Why are you guys identifying with us? It's not about us. It's about Jesus. It's about what Christ did. In fact, he says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos water, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. Paul's posture before the gospel and his posture before others was, I'm nothing. He literally says it there. Who is Paul? Who is Apollos? They're nothing. Jesus is everything. So Paul's focus is on the word, it's on the ministry, it's on the gospel. He sees himself as being incidental to the message, that the central message is Jesus and his gospel come alive. Too often we see pastors, ministers that make this about themselves. It's about what I've done. It's about what I've accomplished. I think my most hated phrase in ministry is my church. My second most hated phrase is my people. And my third most hated phrase is, and we got 100 people saved. So often ministers talk about the church as being their thing, the people being my. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've interacted with people, and they're like, just make sure you don't take my people. Your people. You have no people. Pastors don't have peoples. They don't have churches. Jesus has a church. Jesus has his people. And who is Paul? Who is Apollos? Who is Cephas? Who is Tommy? Nothing. Christ is everything. Too often, we make this about ourselves. And it's not just ministers. Too often, we as believers make this about ourselves. We find ourselves in relationships with people. We find ourselves in interactions with people. And because they say something that hurts our feelings, or they say something that makes us feel bad, or they say something that we think is disrespectful, and what we do is we turn our backs on those people at the expense of the gospel being alive in their lives. We make it about ourselves. It doesn't matter. Jesus Christ was despised and rejected, and he kept coming. Jesus Christ was put on the cross, and he kept coming. He kept coming after the lost. He kept coming after the sinners. He kept coming after those of us who rejected him and mistreated him. Because Jesus Christ was about the mission. He was about what God had called him to. He was about the gospel coming alive in your life and in my life. He kept coming. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he who was God, made it about the mission, made it about the message, made it about the gospel. It didn't say, don't you know who I am, you people? I'm going to destroy you for not treating me right. You think I'm going to save you? Forget that. So many of us in our relationships, we make it about ourselves, and we close the door on the gospel being alive in people because they haven't treated us right. What I love about the example that Paul puts out here is it's not about his personal feelings. It's not about his personal desires. This is about the gospel going forward and nothing else. Paul is forgiving of these rivals, not critical of them, because the crux is about himself. The issue is about himself, not something in his mind that's important. He has no interest in creating conflict about himself. And with that being the context of the passage, we have to make sure we understand something else. This passage isn't saying, don't ever confront other ministers. It isn't saying, don't ever confront other confessing Christians. There is an interpretation of this passage that tells us to not confront or challenge other Christians because at least they're preaching Jesus. And I think it is a wholly wrong view of this passage. And there are a couple of good reasons why I think it's wrong. The first reason is what I just shared with you. That Paul didn't look at this as a gospel issue or a Jesus issue or an integrity issue. It was a ministry rivalry issue. And so Paul was willing to humble himself. He was willing to take the accusations, and he was willing to receive the insults for the sake of the gospel. But the second and probably more powerful reason why it is unreasonable to read this passage like that is because it goes counter to everything else we see from Paul and the other authors of the New Testament. People don't seem to realize that there are many passages in which Paul and Peter and John and James are specifically critical of the integrity and the message brought by other teachers, by other leaders, by other believers even. And they're not vague, and they're not hidden, and they're not even private. He makes bold declarations publicly. That's wrong. What you're doing is wrong. What you're saying is wrong. It wasn't about defending himself. He wasn't about himself. It was about something far beyond himself. It was about the gospel because that's what he lived for. Just in Paul's writing to Timothy, there are about 12 different instances where he calls out a warning about false teachers and false teachings. And on two separate occasions, as he's writing to Timothy, he names names. Just in his writing to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, he writes and says, "Some have rejected these, faith and good conscience, and so have shipwrecked their faith. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I've handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme." That seems pretty direct, doesn't it? He seems like he's willing to say something. And again, in 2 Timothy 2, he names Hymenaeus along with Philetus, saying they have wandered away from the truth. He's confronting and he's naming false teachers. And let me ask you this. How many of you know that there was a conflict between Peter and Paul? How many of you guys know that took place? How do you know that took place? Do you know how you know that took place? Because it's in Galatians chapter 2. Paul writes and he says, "But when Cephas Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, 'If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like Jews?'" He has this conflict where he's sitting there and he sees Peter pretending in one situation. He's indulging with the Gentiles, and then all of a sudden the Jews come and he's like, "Oh wait, I don't want them to see me like that." And so Paul stands up and he calls him a hypocrite publicly in a letter that's going to be passed from church to church meeting. That seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? And not just that, but he writes it in a letter that by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit will be read for generations. And it's in this passage that we see the standard of Paul's stand, right? And we see the standard by which we all should take a stand. "But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel." The standard that Paul holds out is the standard by which he lives, is the standard by which he finds joy, the gospel. The standard by which we should use to confront and criticize those who claim to speak for God. should be both a message and a method that reflects the gospel. Once again, it comes back to the gospel as being the thing. Criticism is warranted when the minister's message is not the gospel, when his conduct does not reflect the gospel. Does anyone doubt that Peter was preaching Jesus? Of course not. But he saw Peter's life and said, listen, that doesn't come into alignment with the gospel. The things you're saying don't come into alignment with the gospel. It's the same standard we have to hold ourselves to and the standard we have to hold others to. You see, the thing is the gospel. Remember what I talked about as being the gospel. The gospel is the life and the teaching and the work of Jesus Christ. When we see people who claim to be Christians and they're living counter to that, they have to be corrected. You have to be willing to be corrected. You have to say the thing is the gospel. The thing is living for Jesus. The thing is knowing Jesus. The thing is propagating Jesus. And you're not doing that with the words you're saying, with the things you're teaching, with the way you're acting. And anyone who truly loves Christ wants that correction. Because like Paul, for them the thing is the gospel. When men and women claim to be followers of Christ, and as a result of being called to be followers of Christ, we are called to be ministers of the gospel. When we deliver a message or live in a manner that is inconsistent with the nature of Christ, with the gospel of Jesus, we need to be confronted and we need to be challenged. The regulating standard is the gospel proclamation of Christ in life and in message. And a believer's commitment to that will be the source of their joy. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. The joy for a believer, for whom the gospel is the thing, is the proclamation of Jesus Christ, is the propagation of Jesus Christ, is the imprinting of Jesus Christ. The proclamation of Christ in word and being is the source of joy for every believer in every circumstance when it is what we care most about. Each of us must embrace the paramount place of the gospel of Christ declared in our lives, by our words, by our actions. If we're going to truly find joy in this place, and I want to remind you what Augustine said. There is a joy that is only found by believers when whose joy is Christ, who live in Christ, who are of Christ, who are for Christ. There is a joy that is only found for believers. Do we proclaim Him in the way we treat our wives and our husbands? Is the gospel declared in the way in which we speak? Do we proclaim Him in the choices we make? Do we forgive as the gospel calls us to forgive? Do we love as the gospel calls us to love? Do we sacrifice as the gospel calls us to sacrifice? Do we submit to the call of the Father as the gospel calls us to submit to what the Father has called us to? When the gospel is our passion, when Christ is proclaimed, in that we will rejoice. In that we will find joy. Let go of your hope in the things of this life, in the approval of man, in the instant gratifications, in the pride of self-promotion, and love the gospel. Love the calling to the gospel and find joy in the gospel declaration that proclaims Jesus Christ. Many of us Christians struggle because we, first of all, don't hold the gospel propagation, the gospel proclamation as first and foremost in our lives. And second, because we don't ourselves make that our goal. When you love the gospel of Jesus, every time it is proclaimed, every time it is revealed, whether in good times or bad, you will find joy in your life. Are you finding joy in Him? Whatever circumstance you find yourself in, are you finding joy in Him?